In this lecture, we'll explore Proverbs chapter 2, verses 1 through 22. This poem can be entitled The Call to Pursue Wisdom, an intense quest with immeasurable rewards. Let's begin by considering the position of this poem within the larger context of the entire book of Proverbs, at least as much as we've seen in its near neighbors. The lecture spanning Proverbs 2 follows on the heels of a pair of competing appeals, each of which sought to enlist the youth into one of two diametrically opposed groups. Either the appeal of wealth would convince the youth to join the gang, a group of hoodlums whose murderous means actually disqualify their enriching but suicidal ends. That span chapter 1, verses 10 through 19. Or the youth would be persuaded to accept Lady Wisdom's counteroffer to bestow her very spirit, thereby securing storm-proof ends. And that span chapter 1, verses 20 to the close, that is, verse 33. Now, as we come to Proverbs 2, this poem assumes that the youth has wisely rejected the gang's appeal, instead choosing in favor of Lady Wisdom's invitation. Here the sage strives to impress on the youth that if he would gain full value from what Lady Wisdom has to offer, he must ratchet up his receptivity beyond the point of arrogant acquiescence. He must pursue wisdom with the level of interest that neighbors on ferocity. The whole of Proverbs 2 promotes the overall worth of wisdom, rather than transmitting specific counsel for successful living. Consequently, the present lecture, that is, Proverbs chapter 2, extends the lengthy and layered wisdom commendation that the sage began in chapter 1. For it will not be until Proverbs 3 that the sage will deliver pointed wisdom content, which itself frequently will be prefaced by additional wisdom commendations, but wisdom commendations of a much briefer sort than we see in Proverbs 1 and here in Proverbs 2. Now for an overview of this poem, that is Proverbs 2. The sage has constructed the lecture of Proverbs 2 as an extensive conditional statement, particularly sections 1 and 2, followed then by a conclusion, which is section 3. Although relatively lengthy, this poem or sapiential lecture is 22 verses in length. It is remarkably simple in its sequence of logic. Bright lines rendered unmistakable by obvious verbal markers signal the transitions from one portion to the next. Let's now read through this lecture. Proverbs chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. My son, if you get hold of my sayings, if it is my instructions that you treasure within you, if in order to pay attention to wisdom you stretch your mind towards understanding, especially if it is insight that you call out to, if it is for understanding that you raise your voice, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden riches, then you will grasp the fear of the Lord, and knowledge of God will you find. For it is the Lord who can grant wisdom. From his mouth he can grant knowledge and understanding. So he will store up success for honest people, a shield for those who walk blamelessly, in order to preserve the paths of justice, and the way of the one devoted to him he will guard. Then you will grasp equity, fair decision, and integrity, every good track. For wisdom will enter your motives, and knowledge will be delightful to your appetites. Forethought will guard you, understanding will preserve you. In order to rescue you from a harmful way, from a man who utters shifting things, from those who abandon paths of honesty in order to walk in ways of darkness, from those who enjoy doing harm. They rejoice in harmful deviations, whose paths are twisted and who get lost along their tracks. In order to rescue you from the foreign woman, from the strange woman, she has lubricated her words, from one who abandons the companion of her youth and has forgotten the covenant with her God. Surely her house has suffered deadly collapse, and her tracks are sinking into the shades. None who approach her will return, nor will they ever attain the paths of life. For this purpose, so you would walk in the way of good folk, and would guard the paths of equitable folk. Mark this, it is the honest who will settle in the land, and blameless ones are the ones who will be left standing there. But it is the guilty who will be cut off from the land, as the violent are the ones who will tear away from it. Let's now examine how this lecture holds together. Proverbs 2 consists of 3 sections, as noted earlier. Section 1 spans the first 4 verses. Here we encounter a complex of if statements, or prodices, the first half of a conditional statement. Section 2 makes up the bulk of the lecture, spanning verses 5 through 19. Here the sage presents a series of then statements, apodices that answer the if statements of section 1. A 3-verse conclusion brings the poem to a close, verses 20 through 22. Let's turn now to those structural devices that span more than one section, so operating at the macro level. There are 3. They consist, first off, of the conditional statements that we've already referred to, joining section 1 and 2. Secondly, there is a macrostructural feature involving section 3, particularly as it relates to closure. And also in section 3, we find a measure of escalation in the progression of thought. Let's turn first then to the conditional statements that knit together section 1 with section 2. The lecture itself opens with an if section, a prodisis, in which the sage maps out the degree of determination that the youth must display if he is actually serious about pursuing wisdom. Notice the particle if in 3 of the 4 verses of section 1, that is verses 1 through 4, which then color that entire section as an extended prodisis. The if section is followed by an even longer then section, that is the apodosis, showing what desirable results will issue from just such a pursuit of wisdom. Here we want to pay attention to the particle then, which marks the opening of each of the units that make up block 2a. And here we're paying attention to the word then that begins verse 5, then you will grasp, and also verse 9, again, then you will grasp. The notion of results persists in block 2b, and that starts in verse 12, indicated by the expression in order to. This, like the particle then, will appear at the start of each of the next 2 units. That is, in verse 12, in order to rescue, and again in 16, in order to rescue. In addition to these conditional statements that link section 1 with section 2, we also find closure operating in section 3, linking it back with sections 1 and 2. Cumulative density generates a high degree of closure right within verse 20, which begins section 3. Let's read that verse. For this purpose, so you would walk in the way of good folk and would guard the paths of equitable folk. Like the closure achieved in Proverbs 1:19, all but the first word of verse 20 here recalls terms already encountered at least once in this chapter, that is Proverbs 2. One example involves the verb guard, which is line terminal if we're reading verse 20 in Hebrew. This verb, guard, recalls the same term, which incidentally was also line terminal in the ending of Unit 2A1. That's verse 8. Notice how the last half of 2:8 reads, "And the way of the one devoted to him will he guard." That same term similarly occurs in the last line of Unit 2A2. That's verse 11. Verse 11 reads, "Forethought will guard you, understanding will preserve you." This is one example of the fact that when we come to verse 20 and we encounter that last word in the Hebrew reading, guard, it should ring a bell. We have heard this in terminal lines of other portions twice before. The only new word to appear in verse 20 is the Hebrew word lema'an, which means for this purpose. It operates here as a marker of conclusion and is appropriate for a final portion. Closure in section 3 is further achieved by recycling two pairs of positive character qualities in verses 20 and also 21. Those in verse 20, good and equitable, recall the same terms that were seen earlier in verse 9. The pair of character qualities in verse 21 are honest and blameless. That pair occurred earlier in verse 7. In this way, we see that section 3 achieves closure due to the density of terms encountered here that occurred already in earlier portions of the poem. The last macrostructural feature is the escalation of some of the thought that's presented in section 3 when compared to section 2. With the second hemistich of verse 20, the sage's counsel escalates. Let's notice how that reads. Verse 20, "For this purpose, so you would walk in the way of good folk," and then this target expression, "and would guard the paths of equitable folk." No longer may the youth rest content to enjoy the protection divinely offered to wisdom followers, as promised in the bulk of section 2. That sort of protection coming from God is articulated in verses 7 and 8, verse 11, and throughout 12 to 19, with words like guard and preserve and rescue. Just as the youth has received protection by virtue of enrolling as a disciple of Lady Wisdom, so now he must in turn extend protection to others, allowing neither shifting evil, note verse 12 and 14, nor seductive unfaithfulness, verse 17, to erode paths of communal loyalty, lest future generations find those paths eroded to the level of impassibility. That threat of erosion is real, evident in the poem's last phrase, which reads, "The violent will tear away from it." So once again, in section 3, we see an escalation in the progression of thought. The disciple youth is not permitted simply to be a passive recipient of these goods, this protection from God, but must mature to the level of emulating God's behavior, extending protection in turn to others. And that's what we find in the last half of verse 20. Our study of Proverbs 2 will continue in the next lecture.